In this video, I'd like to walk you through the content of Lesson 3 in Greek Grammar 1. In this lesson, we're going to look at three important topics: accent, aspiration, and apostrophe. By the end of this lesson, you should really know everything that you need to be able to begin reading Greek words and making your way through Greek reading exercises in Greek Reading 1. So this, combined with Lessons 2 and Lesson 1, makes for a very important lesson. And as I said, if you can master these first three lessons, you should be ready to begin reading in Greek, okay? Now, in Lesson 1, we looked at the Greek alphabet. We learned the 24 letters of the Greek alphabet and their figures in uppercase and lowercase forms. In Lesson 2, we looked at the 7 Greek vowels, we looked at the divisions of the vowels, and the Greek diphthongs. And also in Lesson 2, we looked at the Greek consonants and the different divisions of consonants into mutes and semivowels. Now, in Lesson 3, we're going to continue working, not looking at letters, but looking at symbols that are used in Greek that help us to understand how to pronounce different words correctly. Now, these symbols may look small and insignificant, but they can actually mark different words by these different symbols. So they are very important, and without these, we cannot correctly pronounce or read Greek words. So this is an important lesson. To get started, the first topic to be discussed is accent. In English, we understand accent. We learned it also in Latin grammar, if you've studied Latin grammar. Normally, accent is some extra stress or emphasis put on a certain syllable in a word. In classical languages, though, it wasn't merely a stress accent, speaking louder on a certain syllable. It was also a musical accent, raising the pitch or raising a note on a certain syllable in a word. So, as an English speaker, it's okay, considering what the purpose is of our classical language studies. The purpose is really to read and comprehend and be able to translate and understand Latin and Greek. It's okay to read these accents with stress accent as we do in English. But if you want to be more perfect and study to read and hear the sounds of the language as they would have been heard in the ancient world, you want to try and raise pitch on an accent. Okay, so we'll look at how to do that as we go. The first type of accent that we see is named an acute accent, acute. If you study geometry, you'll know that the idea of an acute angle is that it's sharp. And in grammar, an acute accent is one that marks a sharp rise in pitch on a certain syllable. You can see that the accent mark is written going up from left to right. Okay? Up from left to right means a rise in pitch. That should be easy to remember. Now, if we look at this word and break it down into syllables and focus on each letter, because I know you're just learning to identify the letters and read the words, so we'll read this once together without any accent, and then we'll add the accent mark so you can hear the difference. The first letter is lambda, pronounced L. Then we have omicron, pronounced O, Lo. Then we have gamma, pronounced G, and omicron, again pronounced O, and sigma, pronounced S, logos, logos. Now, if we were to add an acute accent to that first syllable, instead of logos, it would be logos, logos. Okay, that's the acute accent. Logos, logos, logos. If you just want to use stress accent, as we do in English, you could just say logos, logos, but the pitch accent would sound logos. Okay, that's an acute accent. The mark goes up from left to right. The second kind of accent in Greek is called a grave. It looks like grave, but it's pronounced grave. And you can see the mark goes down from left to right. It goes down from left to right because the pitch on a grave accent goes down from normal. To look at this word, the first letter is zeta, makes the sound z. Then omega makes the sound o. And eta makes the sound e. When we put these together, we have the word zoe. Zoe. If we add a grave accent, we have zoe. Zoe. You can hear there's a decline on that syllable, that second syllable in the word. Zoe. Okay, that's a grave accent. And then lastly, we have the circumflex accent. And there's two different forms of a circumflex accent that you'll see in print. Different books use different fonts, and they'll use different symbols to mark a circumflex accent. One is the simple up and down mark, okay? And then the other is more this squiggly symbol called a tilde, okay? Looks like a sideways backwards S. So we have just the raised bow above the letter, or this squiggly tilde. These mark the circumflex accent. Now, on a circumflex accent, we're going to read just as the symbol shows, with a rise and a return to the original sound of the syllables. So this word here, the first letter is phi, so we can read this with the sound f. Then we have omega, o, and sigma, s. If we put these together without any accent, we have phos, phos. All right? If we add the circumflex accent, we have phos, phos, phos. You can hear the rise and the return of the pitch on that syllable. Phos, phos. Okay? That's a circumflex accent. And just for the sake of being complete, you may also see it like this. Okay? Here we have the tilde marking the circumflex. Phos, phos, phos. So either one of those symbols will be found marking the circumflex accent. So we have the acute, which is a rise in pitch, the grave, which is a decline in pitch, and the circumflex, which is both a rise and a return in pitch. These are the three accents used in Greek, which you'll see in your readings and which you need to learn to pronounce when you see them. Okay, so that's the first topic in lesson 3, accent. It's very simple to understand, but the challenge is learning to practice it as you read every word that you see in Greek. Okay? That's accent. Next we have aspiration. Aspiration has to do with breath on a syllable. When we went through the Greek alphabet, you should have noticed that there's no letter H. In English, we have the letter H, which makes a breath sound, like happy. Okay, that's the letter H. In Latin, they have the same letter. They have ha, which makes the sound that rough, aspirated breath. In Greek, there was no letter to represent the letter H and that sound of aspiration or breath. And the reason why is because aspiration is marked in Greek with a symbol. Okay, so it's not a separate letter like in English and Latin. Aspiration in Greek is marked with a symbol. It's a symbol written above a letter, just like an accent mark. Okay, it's a symbol written above a letter. And there are two kinds. There's rough breathing, which means there's aspiration. And there's smooth breathing, which means no aspiration. Okay? The reason why we have smooth breathing is because we mark a vowel. If there's no aspiration, we mark it with a smooth breathing mark just for the sake of clarity. Okay? So here, in this first word, we have an example of rough breathing. And notice the rough breathing mark is shaped like the letter C. So remember that. The rough breathing mark is shaped like a letter C. Whenever we see that rough breathing mark, we're going to make the sound of the letter H, that rough breathing or aspiration, before that letter. Okay, so that mark above the letter tells us that we're going to add aspiration before that letter when we say this word. So let's look at this word. We have an omega, which makes the sound O. We have ro, which makes the sound ra, ra, or r, ra. And then we have alpha, a, o, ra, o, ra. We also see that there's an acute accent. So it's going to say ora, ora, ora. But we also see that there's aspiration. So instead of saying ora, we're going to say hora with aspiration before the omega. Hora, hora. And if we were to turn this into English letters, we would write H-O-R-A. Hora, hora. The aspiration mark is like adding an H before that letter. Hora. And the accent, the acute accent, tells us to raise the pitch on the first syllable. Hora, hora. With a smooth breathing mark, it's a backwards C, a backwards C. And we simply read this as we would if there was no mark. Okay, so this word here, we have alpha, a, nu, n, theta, th, or t, ro, ra, omega, o, p, p, omicron, o, and sigma, s. If we break this into syllables, we have an, thro, pos. Anthropos. Notice that the letter ro, remember, is a liquid, and here it is forming a blended compound consonant with the consonant theta. Anthropos. Now if we add this acute accent, we'll have anthropos, anthropos, anthropos. And then we see that there's smooth breathing, so there's no need to add any aspiration. Hora, hora, anthropos, anthropos. Okay, rough breathing. The mark looks like a letter C. Smooth breathing, or no aspiration, a backwards letter C above a letter. Simple enough to understand, but it takes practice to actually read the Greek correctly, and you're going to have to work on that. Lastly, the third topic in this lesson is apostrophe. And we have apostrophe in English language. For example, we take two words like do not. and we contract them to form don't. We contract these two words to make one word, and we mark a lost letter by what's called an apostrophe. That symbol is called an apostrophe. It marks the fact that we dropped this letter O. We turned a two-syllable phrase into a one-syllable word. That's an example of contraction, and contraction is marked by an apostrophe. In Greek, there are two types of contraction used, or two uses of apostrophe in Greek. The first is caused when a word ends in a vowel and is followed by a word that begins with a vowel. When one word ends with a vowel and the following word begins with a vowel, sometimes we drop one of those vowels to make pronunciation easier and more pleasant. And when we do that, we mark it with an apostrophe. So here you see delta, iota, alpha. That's one word. Dia, dia. And then we have alpha, upsilon, tau, omicron, upsilon. Notice here, this is an important little point to note, we have a diphthong, alpha, upsilon. It's one of our 12 diphthongs, one of the 6 proper diphthongs, alpha, upsilon. That's going to be treated as a single vowel sound. And if you notice, the smooth breathing mark is not over the first letter, but over the second letter, because that breathing mark is recognizing that these two vowels are to be treated as one vowel. So you can see that the location of that breathing mark recognizes that alpha upsilon is a diphthong. Dia, au, then we have tau, omicron, upsilon. This is another diphthong. Au, tu. Notice the circumflex accent. Au, smooth breathing. Au, tu, tu, tu. Circumflex accent. Dia, au, tu. These two words can be contracted by dropping this alpha, and what we're left with is di, au, tu. Di, au, tu. And we mark the dropped alpha with an apostrophe. You can see how much easier that is to pronounce. Dia, au, tu. We can change that to di, au, tu. Di, au, tu. That's a contraction that makes pronunciation easier, or simply allows someone to drop a syllable for whatever reason. It may just sound better to have one less syllable. Dia, au, tu, di, au, tu. Okay, that's an example of contraction caused by vowels. Okay? The second kind of aspiration is caused when the second word begins with rough breathing or has aspiration, and it affects the last consonants of the first word. And we talked about this in the last lesson when we looked at the different mutes, and we looked at the simple mutes, p, kappa, and tau, and then we looked at the aspirated mutes, which were p, ki, and theta, right? Remember that lesson? Here we're going to see an example of this changeable aspirated mute being used when there's an apostrophe. Okay? Let's look at the example. Let me get out of the way. We have this word, nu, upsilon, kappa, tau, alpha. Nuke, ta. Nuke, ta. And then we have this second word. We have an omicron marked with a rough breathing. So it's not going to be O, it's going to be ho, ho, rough breathing and omicron, ho, lambda, eta, e, and nu, n, holen, holen, nukta, holen, nukta, holen. Okay? Now, if we drop this alpha and contract these two words, if we drop this alpha, we would have nukt followed by an aspirated syllable. We can't say kappa and tau and then follow that quickly with an aspiration. So what we do is we change the kappa to the aspirated form of that mute consonant. So we change kappa to ki with aspiration, and we change tau to theta, with aspiration. We add the apostrophe to show that we've dropped the alpha, and then we can pronounce this aspiration here that begins the second word as part of this first word. So instead of nukta holen, which is very slow and choppy and difficult to pronounce, now we can say with a lot of aspiration, nukt holen, nukt holen, nukt holen. Okay? And you can see we can bring that aspiration back into this word by changing these simple mutes into aspirated mutes. Now, I know that that's a lot to understand, and in most Greek classes, the teachers wouldn't explain what's going on there and why those consonants change when there's a contraction. But because we were careful to explain the different kinds of consonants and their characteristics in our second lesson in grammar, we can now look at this, see these changes that take place, and understand why they take place, because we've replaced two changeable mutes that are simple with aspirated mutes, which allow us to easily pronounce this rough breathing in the midst of this contracted phrase. Okay, so that's a lot of information to take in at once. We have the accent used in Greek, and we saw that there are three kinds of accent: acute, grave, and circumflex. Aspiration, just simply adding breath to a syllable. We saw that it could be rough, which is marked with a symbol that looks like a C above a letter, as in hora, hora. Or it can be smooth, which means there's no aspiration added, as in anthropos, anthropos. And then lastly, we learned about apostrophe. If we make contractions in Greek, just like we do in English, we mark that contraction with an apostrophe, and it allows us to drop a syllable by dropping a vowel. And we also looked and saw an example of how the changeable mute consonants can change their letters to help make the pronunciation of a phrase more pleasant or easier to articulate. So that's all for lesson 3. All of this with more examples is included in your lesson. So I hope that that's a good introduction to help just with the basic ideas, point out a couple helpful notes as we go along. And now you have the opportunity to dig into that lesson, do your work as the student, study that lesson for mastery, watch this video a few times if you need to, ask any questions you have. If there's anything that I said or referred to that wasn't clear, or you'd like to have explained a little more, just contact me and I'd be happy to do that. And study through your lesson, all the details of the text of that lesson, because in the lesson I'm able to provide more examples, write things out really clearly. And remember, this is coming straight out of Gretzer's Greek grammar, a Greek grammar written by a famous old Jesuit schoolmaster. So the content of the lesson is very, very good. I hope that it's a helpful introduction to Lesson 3. Now go get to work. God bless your studies.